afternoon, and welcome to this Los Angeles World Affairs Council webinar on tariffs, which I think you'll all agree couldn't be more timely as a topic. I'm Dr. Richard Downey. I'm the president and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council, and it's a real pleasure. Thank you to have you all with us today. Thank you for joining us for what I know will be a very interesting conversation with Dr. Michael Beeman and also Ferdinando Guerra, who will be our moderator. It was just a few weeks ago that President Trump said that for him, tariffs was the most beautiful word in the dictionary. And now, with just over 2 weeks in office, we see what he was talking about, because I think most of us cannot keep up with what's going on with tariffs. We saw him threaten Colombia with tariffs as a way to have them accept flights of migrants. He has threatened 25% tariffs against Canada and Mexico, which were to go into effect yesterday. And he delayed that for 30 days based on what were apparent concessions from the presidents of Prime Minister of Canada and President of Mexico. It remains to be seen whether that was an effective concession, as we've heard now so far that Canadians are booing the U.S. national anthem at sporting events, and there's some anger there. But he has imposed 10% tariffs already now on China. So there's a lot more to come on this, and this is what the discussion will be about today. This is going to be a very interesting very interesting conversation. And again, as I said, it's our heads are spinning about what's going on with this to keep up. But I would like to say that we want you to be part of this conversation. And the way this is going to work is there'll be about 30 minutes of moderated discussion between our speaker and moderator. And then we open it up to you for your questions. And at any time during the session, you can go down to the bottom of your screen and you'll see that Q&A button down there. You can ask a question anytime, and then your questions will come up during that Q&A period. Before I introduce Ferdinando Guerra, our moderator, though, let me just highlight a few upcoming events this month that we have. We have another webinar on the 13th. It's the Dan Schnorr Political Report, which many of our webinar attendees know very well, which is always interesting on what's going on. This one will be particularly interesting. That's on the 13th of February. On the 19th of February, we have a global economic and political outlook, and that's an event with Ken Lipper. He's a Renaissance man, very interesting guy, former deputy mayor of New York, very successful investment banker and investment fund, multi-billion-dollar fund manager, as well as an Oscar-winning producer. So that'll be interesting. On the 26th of February, we have the new police chief, Jim McDonnell, and that'll be a very interesting event at the LA Athletic Club. And then on the 27th of February, we have Fiona Hill, which many of you remember from the last time President Trump was in office on the Ukraine issue. She was a former NSC staffer. That will be at the Skirball Center. So some interesting events later on this month. But now let me introduce our moderator, Ferdinando Guerra, who is a great friend of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council. He is currently the Senior Global Economist and Geopolitical Analyst for the Port of Long Beach, which many of you know is part of the busiest port in not only the United States, but the Western Hemisphere. He's the former Director of Economic Development for Shafter, California, which is essentially the capital of the logistics for the Western states. He was Director of Research for the World Business Chicago, and he's been a professor at Cal State Long Beach and Cal State Fullerton. Again, just to highlight a few of the things that he has done. But again, as I say, he's a wonderful friend to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council, and we're very happy to have him moderate the discussion and to introduce Dr. Michael Beeman. So please, Nando, please take it away. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. And most of all, it's a great honor to be moderating today's webinar. Dr. Michael Beeman served as a senior trade official at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative for over 16 years, most recently as the Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Japan, Korea, and APEC from 2017 to 2023, during which he led the negotiation for the U.S.-Japan trade agreement and the renegotiation of the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, KORUS. From 2023 until last year, he was a visiting scholar and lecturer at Stanford University. He received his doctorate in politics from the University of Oxford in 1998 and is the author of Walking Out America's New Trade Policy in the Asia Pacific and Beyond. And of course, that is the book that he will be focusing on in today's discussion. One quick note that I have to mention is Dr. Beeman also received his master's from my alma mater, Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. So of course, I have to mention that as well. So please, Dr. Beeman, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you to Dr. Downey for his kind invitation to join you and your community. Thank you so much, Nando, for your warm introduction. And yes, our paths feel like they must have crossed at some point in the SAIS community over the last several years. That feels like ancient history to me at this point. And indeed, I think as Richard said at the outset, we are watching in real time a pretty head-spinning rapid transformation in U.S. trade policy at a pace that, I know many of you are trying to keep up with. And I also, as a former person who worked in those hallways, also am trying to keep up with. I worked, as mentioned, for about 16 years in the U.S. Trade Office, working mostly on Asia trade throughout, and worked through beginning in the Bush administration, the Obama administration, the first Trump administration, and then 2 years of the Biden administration. But I left government just over 2 years ago to go, had my wonderful government experiences and opportunities and wanted to really write about this enormous transformation that was going on, both to document some of the occurrences and events that defined that era, starting, I think, probably principally with the inability of the Congress to pass the TPP agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which then shortly after led to, or was followed by withdrawal by President Trump from that agreement. And then everything that has followed since then has really kind of been moving in this very fast-paced direction. Let me, though, just spend about 10 minutes talking about the book, and not because I'm trying to plug a book, but because I really worked very hard to try and come to some understanding myself even about what was going on and why it was happening. If we think back about 10 years, we all remember the focus, of course, and it still is today, but very much at that time was on China, China's rise, China's threat, China's impact on US jobs, communities, production. And these impacts were quite devastating in certain cases on individuals and on families and on communities. So there is a lot to review and to think back about during that period of time. I think it's safe to say the Obama administration, by focusing on kind of a strategic engagement type of agenda in the Asia Pacific through TPP, deepening trade alliances, and in other ways, really didn't tackle the problem as head on and tackled it much more obliquely than I think many of us would, in retrospect, say was necessary at the time. So this certainly opened a doorway and left a sense that U.S. kind of an absence of U.S. leadership in that area in defending the United States on these issues was a part of what was driving the need to change fundamentally U.S. policy. But those of us who worked on trade during this period also knew that there were really much deeper undercurrents going on, and it wasn't China was a huge factor, but it wasn't just China that was causing things like the TPP, which was meant to try and help thwart China to ultimately fail in terms of political support in the United States and in other ways. So I really wanted to write the book to document this and to explore it and understand it, because it was a momentous change. U.S. pursued a trade policy that was not fully consistent, but fairly consistent for about 75 years, from the end of World War II up until around 2000, essentially 17. And that policy, of course, was one of world engagement, one of open trade, one of leading a trading system, a rules-based system that would promote common interests around the world. The idea that trade, while some may do better than others at different points in time, that it lifts all boats and is an opportunity for the world to develop. Trade is very, very messy, so I don't want to paint a Pollyanna picture of what trade policy and trade really is. This is why being a trade official was such a privilege, because I think the one thing that connects all of us who've worked in the trade office is a sense that we really want to defend the U.S. interest. But how that interest has been defined is what has been fundamentally changed and shifted over time. And what really I've come to conclude is driving or has driven this shift really is, as I mentioned previously, rooted in U.S. domestic politics. We have a situation where political polarization in the United States over the last 10 to 15 years in particular, but of course it's been building for quite some time, has really reached all-time record highs. And polling outfits who do polls of political systems around the world call the U.S. level of polarization quite exceptional by international standards. So what has happened is this polarization has led in many ways to a trench warfare, right? This is the familiar warfare we see in Washington between the new right, or even, or called the Trump right, if you wish, and the progressive left in particular. These two poles that have really were on the fringes of both parties, the Republican and the Democratic Party, and now have coalesced into the center of each of the party and are really driving policy, including on trade in many areas. And what happens is with this polarization is the rise of, in these battles, is the rise of zero-sum approaches and thinking. I want to emphasize this, not to get technical or get academic, but really just to focus on it, because unless this is understood, it really, the rest of everything that happened after, I think, is harder to comprehend. So just to review, zero-sum is the idea that the gains of others are coming at the cost of yourself or your community or your country in some way, shape, or form. So what does that have to do with trade policy? Well, it upends, it just flips the table over on everything that has come before in terms of U.S. thinking about the proper approach to trade and fostering this rules-based trading system since the end of the Second World War, and actually just before that as well. And it was really embraced by the leaders of both parties and presidents of both parties throughout this period of time, and became a sort of the U.S. consensus that was formed by these, more traditional Republican adherents and more moderate Democrat adherents that enabled the U.S. leadership of this trading system to continue to build it out and build it up, basically. As I mentioned, trade was always messy and difficult, so that's a very simplistic picture of the situation, because there have been, trade tensions. One of the things that got me interested in trade actually early on was being a university student and witnessing the trade tensions and conflict going on with Japan at the time, for example. So I remember that very well. But by and large, this was the approach, and it was the sense that trade was a greater source of opportunity for America than it was a source of harm. But in a zero-sum world, with zero-sum thinking, this is all flipped upside down, basically. And this, perhaps a surprise in all of this to many is that there's these two polar opposite, at war political factions in both parties are in alignment, and in surprising alignment when it comes to some parts of U.S. trade policy. So you have the previous, kind of moderates in both parties driving the system of building the trading system, maintaining commitment to open trade, maintaining commitment to the rules, pushing the rules on others, enforcing the rules on others, etc. But now you have an alignment where the alignment is that trade is a greater source of harm than it is of opportunity. And this is coming from the zero-sum view that's focused on issues like China, on globalization, on economic security, on the trade deficit, on sovereignty or the lack of, or the loss of sovereignty. So there's a lot of different pieces and components here. But in the external dimension of trade vis-a-vis foreign countries, and also the role of multinationals in that trade, and particularly when it comes to producing overseas and exporting back to the United States, that those are all seen in this very bidimensional, you know, zero-sum sort of game of who's winning and losing. And it's measured by things like trade deficits. It's not measured by things like, are the rules fair and are the rules working? And is this a fair and a system and a fair approach? At the same time, however, as this kind of new consensus is starting to form between what were the far left and the far right are now much more in the middle of their individual parties, they're also, of course, as we all know, those of us in the United States anyway, are engaged in very bitter zero-sum battles at home over what the rules should be here in the United States for the economy, on social matters, on values, etc. And those divisions are very intense, and there is virtually no alignment in this space on much of anything. And the degree to which one side is prevailing in terms of their rules, the other side wants to take that away, essentially, when they have the opportunity to gain power. So what happens is the U.S., which built the trading system, the world trading system, its own trade commitments on these past U.S. principles, and built it up layer by layer based on consensus that was reached layer by layer, is now all being pulled apart by these two sides that are fighting over what those rules should be in the United States. So that's a very simplistic explanation of what this is. But what it means is the U.S. has a vision. The extent that it has a new vision for trade is on erecting barriers, basically. It is on stemming the harm and not looking and seeking and trying to negotiate for the opportunities that may come the way of the United States. And at the same time, the focus is on, there's a lack of vision for what the rules should be, because both sides are pulling back and forth as to what the rules should be in the United States. And those rules that we used to have in trade agreements, or that are still in some of the ones that still exist, are under attack, basically, consistently, as not serving one side or the other's interests in terms of the status quo in the United States. So that is kind of the sum of the book. But the book really covers a lot of the issues where these two kind of complementary areas of alignment in terms of the new U.S. policy. What you see now is erecting more barriers to trade, and then this fight, not really having a consistent or coherent vision for the future. And this includes, the episode of walking out and walking away from the TPP, the tariffs, of course, not just on China and tariff policy that got underway in a big way in the first Trump administration, but the Biden administration continued this, to my point about consistency and alignment in terms of the external harm from trade. And how those have been used, and the reasons why these tariffs were instituted, and the arguments that were used for them. It's a focus on fixing the past, right? It's renegotiating past agreements that were all wrong or done terribly by bad negotiators or incorrect assumptions of the past. And that view was shared very much by both the Trump and the Biden administration. So the need to go back and fix the past. And then refusing to engage further to kind of open the U.S. market and engage in more open trade going forward. So this is all leading in the same direction, which is walking out on past U.S. obligations and past U.S. priorities for trade. So if you agree with where this is all headed, then you're in luck, because this is the new trajectory for U.S. trade policy. I think this is here to stay, at least for the foreseeable future. And obviously, it will for the next 4 years with the Trump administration. And I'll come to that in just a moment. If you have concerns about this, or you disagree with this new trajectory, I think it's vital to understand the zero-sum dynamic that's going on here in order to understand how to represent your interests, or represent new ideas or different ideas for how U.S. might do better at trade policy, if that is your view. So I want to just, before I end here, I want to be clear, make no mistake, there are reasons to walk out on trade, on trade partners, on trade agreements. I did this myself as a trade official a few times, and not every deal is worth making, and not every deal is worth saving, and that is the nature of change that we all have to account for. But I think what we're seeing now is just fundamentally different than the one-off or the two-off needing to fix or amend or rewrite or renegotiate an agreement. It is just a fundamental change in the whole approach to trade. So this is going to cause, of course, retaliation and fragmentation of this rules-based system. The goal, obviously, is for the U.S. to go it alone more. So it's really not able to project to the extent to which other countries value a rules-based system. It's not able to really project that leadership anymore to forge that. We're very similar in some ways with where we were 100 years ago, when Franklin Roosevelt and others felt that these tensions could be better channeled into this sort of trading system that I described that lasted for 75 years. And obviously, we're now in the Trump 2.0 era. And the president in his inaugural address spoke about the need to overhaul our trade system, and through tariff and taxing foreign countries and the rest. I've been very clear that I think that if Trump were reelected, which he was, then not only we're going to see a continuation of this trajectory, we're going to see it supercharged. It will be like 18 Mack trucks headed down the highway at the same time. Just briefly, and we can talk about this, Nando, in our discussion and obviously in the questions, what has changed or anything different from 1.0 to 2.0? I think there's a clear sense on the side of the administration and the president that they have a full mandate. They campaigned on a lot of these promises for a long time, and they are ready to move forward. I've looked in great detail at the first executive order on trade that came out, calls for 23 different studies on different trade issues. A lot of that, virtually all of it, or say the vast majority of it, is very familiar to me. These were issues that were debated and discussed in some way, shape, or form during the first Trump administration. And sometimes decisions were made to move forward and to make changes. Sometimes there was a sense of holding back. I think there will be less holding back this time, and it will be less only up to the extent that the domestic resistance or opposition to it allows this to occur. Tariffs, yes, I think this is on everyone's mind. Mexico, Canada, 25%, China, 10%. Why is that? Why are we seeing pauses and the rest? Just briefly, and maybe, Nando, maybe we should talk about this, because maybe it'd be helpful to get your kind of perception or your take on some of this, sitting, looking out into the port of Long Beach, where this is all happening in real time and the impacts are real, to suss out what all this may mean going forward. How about that?
Absolutely. No, thank you so much for that big picture summary of your book. And let me actually start with a big picture question, particularly for our audience here, obviously in Southern California. So let me put it this way. What do you think are the real potential consequences or implications on the U.S. economically and diplomatically if the Trump administration goes through with these tariff threats? And most importantly, like I said, for our audience tonight, what would this translate into for California and Southern California, being that we are the epicenter of U.S. trade as the international trade capital of America, and where trade is the most critical industry to our regional economy?
Right. Well, I mean, and obviously, even Asia trade, I think, will be more impacted in some ways than if you were on the Atlantic side. But I believe, and this is where there's been a lot of chatter about whether this is, these tariff threats are all just tactics, or if this is a real thing that is going to come to pass, including the idea of a universal tariff. They pledged 10% on the world, roughly, I think sometimes it said 10 or 20%, and higher for China, basically. I think that is all very much in their intention and is very real. The real question is the degree to which there's domestic pushback down the line. And I think during the first administration, they did run into opposition, not so much on the China tariffs. The China tariffs remain fairly supported in terms of polling and public opinion as a necessary act to take this stand. But when the U.S. imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum, EU and others retaliated. U.S. stakeholders that were dependent on those export markets got pretty upset. The whole mood about tariffs began to shift quickly and not in a positive direction. And they became much more controversial and much more complicated as a tool. So I think what you're seeing now is, and we can get into the specific Mexico and China in a second, but I think you're seeing the building up of an approach to try and achieve something that looks like a universal tariff. So this really is going back to the 1920s and 30s. It then was called a protective tariff. So basically, the question is what level do you set it at, and the rest. So what it means economically for your region and for others is, I think that this is the expectation that the point is to slow imports and to find a way to convert that into increasing domestic production. So as to how that washes out in your local economy, I'll let your local economists look at that. But I think more fundamentally, it really is going to create an enormous number. And I saw this in the first Trump administration, and even in the Biden administration, with some of the policies they pursued, did cause a great deal of irritation, even with our allies, in terms of, they don't like to be targeted. Basically, they feel that the commitments are on paper, and the U.S. is breaking those commitments in order to go its own way. So that will create a lot of, I think, turmoil, both in terms of traditional friends as well as with adversaries.
Since you have direct experience, obviously, working for the current administration the last time around, and of course with other administrations as well, but specifically due to the fact that you already worked for the current administration, what are your expectations this time around over the next 4 years? And getting back to specifically China, which of course for us is what is most important. Roughly 70% of the Port of Long Beach's imports come from China, and roughly 50% for the Port of LA. So obviously that's our big point of focus. Also, the rest of Asia as well. What are your expectations? And I know that's your area of expertise. And then, of course, also with regards to what we've seen over the last 24, 48 hours with respect to Canada and Mexico, and then also potentially with the EU. And again, back to whether or not do you believe there will be a universal, across the board, and not necessarily just targeting particular countries?
Right. I think a universal tariff is the goal of the president and the goal of some of his staff. I think whether it comes to pass will kind of be a function of how much, as I say, domestic opposition is brought against that concept and idea. I think they're setting the stage and the table for that with this idea of the External Revenue Service to collect tariff revenue. The idea that of basically readjusting the congressional budgets to expect tariff revenue to fill a certain amount of dollar income in order to balance out some of the tax cuts and other policies and approaches they want to take. So I think the pathway is very much there, and there is an intention to do that. We'll see if the domestic pushback comes. Of course, there are already significant tariffs on China. They just imposed a 10% tariff on, additional tariff. My view on China is that is this, and this is just a very frank view, this is reflecting no inside information whatsoever. This is just me remembering how these issues were discussed and thinking about how these issues were thought about from the past. I want to be very clear about that. And that is that I think the 10% was set at 10% because in the full expectation, this is going to go up. Whether they remove permanent trade normal trade status from China, which would permanently increase the rate, or they do it in this series of escalatory tariff wars. They know China's going to retaliate, and 10% becomes 20%, becomes 30%. And the next thing you know, we're at a higher level that they want to maintain. Whether all products will be covered, I will see. Those are the terms and conditions. But I think that is where they're trying to head. I think for Mexico and Canada, it seemed very high to start at 25%. But I go back to this point I made earlier about support for the tariffs. I think they, and this is actually reflected in Lighthizer, my former boss's own book, there's a sense that the tariffs, when they were imposed, did get this pushback, particularly on the rest of the world. And I think they're trying to set trying to equate tariff success with delivering on important issues for the American people instead of as a tariff issue. So this is why they're linked to border issues, linked to legal drugs, linked to immigration, because these issues are, basically, and actually, I've just heard it today, I think, from a Trump administration official, it is expressed the following way, which is, if you're not for the tariffs, then you must be for fentanyl. Of course, no one ever wants to think in those terms, but it's also sort of a false choice. There are many other things and ways to achieve that goal, but they're trying to tie the tariffs as something that's going to deliver for the American people. And then, but I don't think the intention is to go back to 0%. I think the intention is to probably drop it down to, do a deal, drop it down to say 10% and try and keep it there. So this is my point about kind of how they're approaching trying to bring this agenda into force in a more thoughtful way, than in a more strategic way than they did last time, to bring Americans on board. Then I think the EU is next, others are next. Question is just how far it can spread and how far it can go, and what the legal basis and what the rationale would be. But I believe that this, again, with no inside information, is what they're intending to do. This is the way I read why Mexico and Canada would get 25% and China would get 10%.
If I may, I'd like to ask one or two if we have time. And then, of course, I want to get to the audience questions. With respect to getting back to what we obviously saw for the first 75 years of the U.S. leading the way with respect to obviously always advocating for free trade. And now that we've moved towards protectionism, and of course, as you clearly articulated, it's both sides of the political aisles. What would it take, in your opinion, to get back to what we saw for the first 75 years after World War II, and what role can all of us play in trying to get back to there?
Yeah, I think it's very hard to see kind of a simple switching the light switch on or off and kind of going back in time. I think there were a lot of people who were assuming and expecting the Biden administration would head that direction, and then it very much did not at all head that direction. In fact, it stayed very much in this other lane that I'm talking about. And I think this is the lane that we're in. So really, to me, the question is what a what a new normal could look like, that it looks more like what you just described, Nando. And there's two or three different scenarios here. One is that we keep marching in this direction until things come off the rails, be it markets react very strongly against this, and we end up in some sort of stock market crash, or we end up picking a war or picking conflict, that Americans said, well, what is this actually all about? Is it all about tariffs and that 10% or whatever retaliation that we got in return? So I think that's one scenario. Another scenario, I think, would really require kind of the rebuilding of a consensus on trade in a more positive direction in Washington first. But I think that there is an opportunity to recast and imagine what the trading system should look like. And maybe, for example, maybe the U.S. could, start an effort to create a new WTO. Basically, like the old WTO is sclerotic and it's broken, and the U.S. added to that, but it was a problem. And so maybe there's a new terms and new approach that could be brought in and introduced instead. But that would require this kind of political alignment that we're not seeing at the moment, where there are moderates on both sides that kind of have a bigger vision for what the U.S. role in trade can be. So I'm not terribly optimistic that we're going to see that anytime in the very near future. And I think it really is going to take a shift in U.S. Approach, and it will be different than the trading system we saw in the past.
Thank you. Let me now get to some of the audience questions, if I may. Let's start with what is the connection between tariffs and dumping?
Right. So, the flip side of the free trade coin or open freer trade coin is, the fact that countries take advantage of that, and they have, over many decades, have freely dumped their products in the U.S. market, but in not just the U.S. and other markets as well. This often happens when countries have overcapacity. They're industrializing very rapidly. They have too much production. So there's an opportunity to dump it. But dumping also can be strategic, of course, which means to drive your competitors out of the market in which you're dumping, so that you can then take reign over the market. So there is actually an anti-monopoly component to it as well. And anti-dumping tariffs and duties were very much a part of the original GATT system, became WTO system, a legitimate exercise in defending from unfair trade practices, basically. And it was, so it's sort of the other side, is basically it's stemming the harm, essentially. So typically, if you have, if there's an investigation and dumping is found by a foreign nation, then the U.S. is allowed to raise tariffs for a period of time. Oftentimes, it stretches out for 6, 8, 10 years, in particular industries to allow first of all, to kind of punish and to reset and allow the U.S. industry to not go under and to be able to operate economically while in the face of this kind of behavior, basically.
Let's go to the second question here. If we shift from discussing a zero sum versus global trade as a good framework, wherein trade is the objective because all the world benefits, to trade policy as a component of security policy, what do you propose is the appropriate alignment between chosen trading partners who might support security arrangements? And then framed another way, if the U.S. decides on a more isolationist approach, what is the best trade policy framework to support that?
Right. Well, I mean, like it or not, certainly the case right now is that trade policy is foreign policy. The sense of using trade tools and resetting trade arrangements with other countries is the foreign policy and is very much at the center. So this is a very different approach to international relations and the rest, and I won't go off all into all of that. But certainly this tie is been being made by the Trump administration, which, for decades, a lot of the resistance to freer and open trade by critics of that approach was that foreign policy goals should not be driving free, trade agreements and trade deals, because that is selling out U.S. economic interests for foreign policy goals. And so, instead you get kind of the opposite approach that we're taking right now, but ironically still similar. So we are in this upside down, flipped over world in terms of where we were and where we are now. I think that eventually the United States is going to get back to the point of recognizing that a certain degree of interdependence is not a bad thing, and can be a good thing if there's a political consensus for it, and if it's managed in a way that people feel that there's a winning relationship there for both sides. That's not where we are right now. But the term I use is, rather than alliances, rather than friends and partners or all these other terms, I prefer to use the term to try and build a web of what I call trusted trading partners. And trusted trading partners to me means trading partners with which you have established that feeling and sense of commonality, of actual mutual benefit, of complementarity in terms of the types of products that are being traded, a sense of balance and a sense of fairness to the extent that can be achieved. And I think that is sort of the best way of thinking about what the future might look like after we've upset probably every other country with after a series of tariff. I shouldn't be laughing, but that's it. But with a series of tariff threats.
Next question, how will the markets be affected due to the tariffs? For stock owners, would it be a negative?
Well, it's very complicated, right? And I think it is fair to say the president is one of the things he is focused on is what the market's doing. So that is a touch point and sensitivity. But there was a great article, and I read it, actually, I printed it out. It's right here. It's John Sindro, I guess, in the Wall Street Journal. I'm not familiar with the writer. It's called Are Markets Underestimating the Tariff Problem? To me, that was the perfect, like, it was just well-written article. So it's one to maybe look up. Basically, it makes the point that maybe markets are being over-optimistic about what this really means. Certainly, if my prediction is true, which is that we are headed toward a universal tariff of some kind, or at least they're trying to get to that point, this is a huge issue. And I think the point he made was that just because we pull back for 30 days on tariffs with Canada and Mexico, and markets think that this is all a tactic and that it's all going to go back to where it was, is probably only encouraging the president to think he can go further. So, and to keep going down this pathway. So I think that's a really good touchstone to read. And I'm certainly not going to speculate as anyone's financial advisor. But nonetheless, I think that's a good place to start to kind of think about that question.
No, absolutely. And undoubtedly is going to impact financial markets, commodity prices, currencies, as we've seen.
Right.
So
interest rates.
Exactly. Absolutely. Next question. Do you think that China will withhold strategic/critical metals from the United States? How big a deal do you think it might become?
Right. I think China's learned obviously as well from the first 4 years of the Trump administration, and then, continued to, actually, the Biden administration hiked tariffs even further on China to try and wash out this political issue that was in play before the election. I think China is going to use every tool that they have, and this is obviously a certain guardrail up to a point. And those threats are real, and I think the U.S. is, the Biden administration in particular, the Trump administration was very concerned about the harm, and the Biden administration was even more focused on not just that, but also the exposure and risk from being dependent on China. And so I think this is all going to accelerate, but there are going to be major trade-offs here, and I feel confident that China will use whatever tool it's shown it does it with other countries, and there's no particular reason when feeling forced to by U.S. action to do the same with the U.S.
Next, who are the winners and who are the losers of these tariffs?
Wow. There's two completely different ways to look at it. The Trump administration is preaching that, of course, America will win. There may be short-term pain, but that this will bring about this whole renaissance of manufacturing in the United States. We don't need to make it, import it when we can make it here, and this is going to make that possible in combination with a series of other policies and incentives. The flip side of that, of course, is I think we all can imagine what that is, which is that doesn't take off as anticipated. That we're basically just left with a higher import tax on a lot of products that maybe we shouldn't necessarily be making in the United States, but that there could be some positive benefit in some sectors, and maybe that is a good thing for the U.S. economy. But overall, it may not work as beautifully as expected or intended. So I think it's very hard. These are very complicated, very hard economic decisions to make. But one thing that is factual is that exports are going to take a hit because the U.S. is the second largest exporter. And so we still produce a lot of stuff and we still sell a lot of stuff around the world. and the extent to which the U.S. is raising tariffs on others and facing retaliation from others, that is going to be a pretty big impact as well. So that's something which not many people are talking about, but that is reality.
Absolutely. Next question from the audience is, how do we reconcile the stated goal of consumers to buy made in the USA, but they actually prefer to buy as cheaply as possible at cheaper stores, even if this means products are made in China or another place with potential exploited labor?
Right. Wow. That is well, I guess the question is the degree to which the imposition of these tariffs is going to, force those decisions to be made in some way. Reality is, just to be frank, quite a number of these products are probably not still going to be made in the United States. You could increase the tariff by 10 or 20%, and if the currency realigns, right, because of higher interest because of some of these policies, because of tax cuts and other things, then you're it's not much, it's more, it's closer to a wash than it is a hit. So it's extremely complicated. I remember I was doing a talk for a group of economists, and who feel very lonely these days, I should say. And I could see, they were just trying to think about the 3 or 4 different major platforms that the Trump administration is trying to pursue, of increasing tariffs, reducing the deficit, cutting taxes, and all these things. And these are professional economists, as they couldn't line up like what the line was going to look like going forward, because all these things are in play. So it feels a little like a pinball machine. So I don't feel like I can speculate, but I'll just offer those thoughts, because I think it will depend on the sector. It will depend on whether there are incentives to produce. It'll depend on a range of other factors that are just sort of beyond what you or I or anyone can predict at this stage.
Yeah, especially with everything that led up to the election with respect to the higher costs of living and things of that nature, and how how important that was to the results. So the last thing I would assume is consumers want are higher prices at this point. So really interesting question for sure, and see how that plays out. You mentioned U.S. practices zero-sum game, but within the U.S. and international policy now, as it relates to Mexico, Canada, and China, is that thought process also shared by those countries?
Well, I think they're having to react as though they're in this game. And I think that's why I'm making this point, because I think once you begin to understand what that is and what it looks like, it becomes easier to interpret what you're seeing and hearing. No, I'm not saying you agree with it or like it, but I think that this kind of this idea of shared, X and Y, you can get to an outcome. You can get to potentially some sort of deal, and maybe it's in the interests of both sides, but it's just a fundamentally different, and it's not based on following the rules and focusing on rules as the guideposts and as the lodestar, if you will, of what a fair trade system looks like. Instead, it's a results based and transactional sort of approach. So I think that is I think it's forcing the world to react more in this way. And that is, as I say, sort of the world we were in back in the 20s and 30s, that led U.S. officials to go in a different direction.
Next question, just look at the time situation. If you were in charge of trade now, what would you recommend, or what policies would you enact?
Sure. Yeah, I have no problem with things like reviewing past trade agreements to see if they're in the U.S. interest. But I think in order to undergo those kinds of activities, and I don't mean just to stop at that. If something that's not in the U.S. interest, it's necessary to do something about it. But this is the challenge: is that there's a lack of consensus on what that interest is today, because it is so dispersed. Be it you're for an importer, you're an exporter, if you're sitting at the port, if you're a farmer, dependent on exports, if you're a manufacturer, that has problems with imports. it's so complicated. So to me, and this sounds a little off maybe, and not so specific, but I think it is really trying to rebuild a consensus around what it is the U.S. what is the U.S. interest in trade. And that's an extremely difficult thing to do in this very politicized environment. But I think it is possible. But I think without that, it's going to be hard to take specific actions that will return. If your goal is to return the U.S. to a leadership position in the world on these issues, which I think, having experienced it myself, the world is, as much as you or I may be focused on domestic concerns, everyone across the world is looking at the United States. I could sense that. I also worked on APEC. There's 20 other economies in APEC. And whatever I said or our delegation said, the world pays deeply and very close attention to it. So there's no lack of influence. There's no lack of hope, and that the U.S. will lead in this way. Of course, some don't. Some want to stop that, and some want to do it themselves. But by and large, I think that's the world that I'm familiar with, and I think we need to get back to that.
And then the perfect segue to the next question, and I wish I had the opportunity to chime in. I wish we had many more hours to discuss all of this, but isn't it the consensus among economists and trade experts that fair, open trade leads to economic growth, while tit-for-tat protectionism does the opposite?
I think for the most part, that's right, in terms of what economists think. Or certainly they can plot that out and they can document at least that view. But here's the thing. Generally, those studies are done in terms of measuring economic welfare, which is a very broad measure of welfare and does not get into who within the system is doing better and who is doing worse. And so that is obviously a point of contention, is to, that not everyone has benefited, obviously, and I think we all note that that's true. The question is, what is in the U.S. interest, and what system can that look like? I think also, whether or not, I think there is pretty significant evidence that the tariffs are, can work in certain cases, but for the most part are a drag on economic activity. Certainly, uncertainty is a drag on economic activity, and that's very much the environment we're in right now. So even just the uncertainty of tariffs also is having an impact. But there are others that have different numbers. There are others that believe firmly that trade deficits have killed U.S. jobs, which is an extremely intuitive thing to think through. Some economists show it and try and prove it on paper, but that's a fairly minority view among economists. But the point is, actually, in my book, I'll put virtually no numbers in the book, because everyone has their numbers now. Everyone has their own numbers and their own assumptions and their own conclusions. And in a zero-sum world, there is only one right answer.
Unfortunately. It looks like we have one more question from the audience. Are the proposed tariffs designed to align with a future where IA-driven automation reduces the demand for low-wage labor, thereby impacting immigration patterns?
Wow. I may not be the best person to be a futurist. It's a great question.
Great question.
But I may not be the person to be the futurist with a futurist mind to be able to dig deeply into that. I will say this, though, interestingly, about AI, and if you think of it this way, and I think it's important for everyone at least to get more in tune with what the other side is saying, if you feel like you're on a side, or maybe you don't even know you're on a side, which is, I think for the working class, for manufacturer, people work in manufacturing facilities in particular, I think obviously the extent to which they have been harmed by trade, they really feel that direct impact, having lost a job or whatever. And I think what AI poses for the professional class is a similar kind of uncertainty and unease and concern, that maybe, you know, it's not trade, but it's AI that's coming for you, basically, and your job. So if you think of the sense that people get when they feel vulnerable, they feel exposed, and they don't feel like they have a mechanism to back them up, that does drive different conclusions than maybe one would have normally taken.
Absolutely. And we've seen it as a result of economic globalization, and you're essentially saying now it's technology and AI again could drive those fears and obviously influence how people feel and lead to that more of that populism in general
Right.
that we're living through right now. Um, Curious to maybe touch upon, if we have a few minutes here, with respect to the potential creation of the External Revenue Service. How obviously I understand it's based on what the actual scale and you know whether or not it's universal, and is it applied to all of our obviously our imports, all goods. But do you foresee a significant amount of tariff revenues being generated that could actually, you know, mathematically, it's impossible for them to replace, you know, this notion of replacing income taxes and things of that nature. But do you foresee it could be something that is substantial and a positive?
Well, I mean, whether it's substantial or not, I think it can be substantial. You're right. I don't think it would be, you know, a majority contribution to the U.S. Treasury, because you would have to increase tariffs so high that trade would just fall off the map, basically, to try and get to that point, and you would reach the point where you wouldn't be able to gather revenue, even because there's no imports or fewer imports. But as to whether it's a, you know, a positive contribution, you know, that, you know, frankly, I think that all comes down to whether and how this money is spent and on whom. And I think we're all will have very different, various views about what that is. You know, so as to whether it's used in a positive way or not, it's impossible for me to say.
And one last question, if I may, with respect to the universal tariffs. I know throughout the campaign, what was mentioned, anything from 10 to 20%. Do you, I know you've already stated that you believe, you know, it's leading to a universal, but could you foresee anything more substantial than a 10 to 20%? And I'm asking, you know, with respect to for us as the port, if we do see a significant amount on Chinese goods, what we saw last time around is, you know, primarily the movement from sourcing from China to countries like Vietnam. If there is that substantial universal, then and it impacts Vietnam as well, then that's where things could get, you know, very interesting for us, where then it could have a great impact on our volumes. So I guess the question is, if there is going to be a universal, do you foresee it being anything potentially more than 10 or 20%?
I mean, I don't think politically that that's possible, and I think even 10 is going to be hard. And I think this is why it's a step by step and an uncertain outcome. Um, you know, but I think on individual countries and in individual sectors, there will be higher tariffs. And the obvious one is China. I think it's 100% sure that that will end up higher than it would with virtually any other country, because that is still a big focus. But you know, rather because of unfair trade practices or because of currency manipulation, or you know, and maybe not just for the short term, but for the longer term. You know, I think some countries may be in for a higher tariff rate, but I certainly think they're going to, and if this has already been pretty much previewed, to raise tariffs higher in individual sectors on the world, global imports. So it's a mixed bag, I believe.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Downey. I'll give it the floor to you in concluding the webinar. And thank you very much.
Well, Nando and Michael, thank you both very, very much for fascinating conversation on to helping us understand what tariffs are, what role they play, and the potential impact of tariffs on what we're trying to do in the months ahead. I think this is a story we need to continue to follow, and we're going to have you all back for to see how this plays out in the coming months. And with that, I want to ask our audience. It's you'll note in the chat there's a link to supporting the Los Angeles World Affairs Council. Nonprofits like ours live or die based on your contributions. So if you are in a position to do so, we would really appreciate you helping to support more webinars like this and the kinds of activities we do to try and bring you information on critical topics like tariffs, like we've done with this webinar. So if you're able, please go to that link and just click on it and donate if you can. But I do want to thank all of our members for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you on. Great questions along the way. And I also want to thank Krista Seitz, our programs manager, who you didn't see, but in the background, it was her that coordinated all this, put together all this on the backside of this, and orchestrated getting their questions to Nando. So I want to thank Krista. But we look forward to seeing you all one more time to remind you on the 13th we have the Dan Snur Political Report webinar. On the 19th, we have Ken Lipper. The 26th, we have Police Chief Jim McDonnell. And on the 27th, Dr. Fiona Hill. So we look forward to seeing you all at some of these, not only this month, but in coming events. But again, Michael, Nando, thank you so much for a great session. And we look forward to seeing you all again, and good night.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.